Hello and welcome to episode 478 of the HaskinCast Podcast. I am your host, Scott Haskin, and on this episode, we're kind of doing this on an off day because this correlates with the premiere of the movie Blood in Them Hills, and I am so happy to have my good friend and incredibly talented composer, Kevin Ty, with me to talk about the movie and the score and, tell us how it all came together. Kevin, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me, Scott. And 478, I have to commend you. First of all, congrats.
Thank you.
That's a ton of episodes, man. Well done.
Well, I don't have a lot of things that I do outside of recording. So if I'm not recording, this podcast or my Smoke on the Water podcast, or working on music somehow, I would just sit there and stare at the wall. So it keeps me out of trouble.
Amen. I'm the same way. I've got to do something audio at some point.
Yeah, for sure. And it's really amazing. I was thinking about this the other day when I reached out to you. I've watched your career go from before you were really even doing any film composing at all, and you were just writing this kind of stuff that isn't in a style that I would particularly listen to because it was very I don't know what the genre was, but it's, very electronic, very, pulse beat driven. And it's just not a genre that I was ever attracted to. But then when I started to hear your tracks, I'm like, you know what, this is actually pretty enjoyable. And then I watched you grow into becoming an audio engineer and a film composer. And man, it's just been such a pleasure watching you go from that to where you are now.
Well, thanks. I mean, you literally watched me, I have a music background. Even before I moved to the States in 2003, I worked on a couple of video game scores and things with a good friend of mine. But yeah, really sort of dropped out when I moved here and emigrated and sold all my gear in England, and took a while to get built back up. Got involved in the local film scene, and then on the acting side, and then that itch, you got to scratch it, right? That if you've done audio for a while, you're like, hey, I need to get back into this. So I slowly sort of meandered my way back in and picked up where I left off in England, which was very much like Americans call it EDM. I mean, everyone's aware of like electronic music now, but back in the early 2000s, that's basically a European thing. You still had the American like dance music in pockets, but it was in no way as big as it was as in Europe. So I kind of brought that sensibility over, and that's where I started. But where I really wanted to go was kind of where I've ended up, which is kind of starting to involve more live instrumentation, because everything's electronic and in the box, right? So in the box meaning it's a synthesizer, whether it's a keyboard or it's a soft sampler like a computer sampler. And then there was no recording. So I learned my recording or my sound engineering kind of as I went. And so it went from a period of writing these electronic scores and then sort of getting instruments being played and then recording those instruments and then just learning. And, now it's full on, banjos, violins, drums, vocals, you name it. In fact, I think you were present on one of the vocal sessions for an album I did about 12 years ago. So,
yeah,
that was how basic I was back then. I was like, Scott, help me. I don't know what I'm doing. What do I do with this microphone? So I've come a long way, and it's been a great journey though, because I've learned so much and still learning a lot. But for me, it's like opening up my mind to live instruments. Just takes you in a completely different way, like a completely different space. So I still write the same way, as I would on a computer, but when you've got an actual musician there with you, you just go in this completely different level, and that's where I've been exploring the last 8-9 years.
Well, and it's a very natural progression too. Musicians want to have the most alive feel in their music. And while you could spend hours and hours programming samples, and I mean, the samples are brilliant these days. They definitely give that realistic sound, but there's a difference in a live player and playing the articulations in I'm recording this in one take setting versus, okay, now I have to use this note, but I have to use a vibrato sound so that sounds more realistic. Then I have to go to a straight note. We could sit there and program that for days and it'd never be as good as just having one person at least doing one layer over the top of what we've programmed.
Well, that was the epiphany. That was exactly what happened. Is I was trying to get a guitar sound, and as good as samples are nowadays in the computer, you still can't get guitars, in my eyes, right. And so I worked for 3 or 4 days on, actually it's probably a couple of weeks on this piece for a film years ago. And I just had a friend of mine come in with a guitar and he got it in 10 minutes. It was like, I was like, why didn't I just do this? So that's kind of where I went with this. And, being a huge like Western fan, a good segue into sort of the films I've worked on in the last few years. I've always wanted to do a Western, and I've always loved the instrumentation, Sergio Leone movies and Ennio Morricone, all these kind of like amazing Western scores. And I've always wished, I'd love to do something like that. So not that I've done anything close to that, but that you'll hear some of those types of themes in the music I write, because that's the sound of the West, right? That you can't have a Western without that, lonely violin,
right?
That banjo, jaw harp, all these instruments that are completely alien to me, but they just invoke that sound. And it's like, well, you just can't have a Western without that. And so that's all the scores I've done. I bought, I think I own 2 jaw harps. I've got 4 or 5 harmonicas. I can't play any of them, but I know enough to sort of get a sound, right? And then you can fix it in the computer and do whatever you want to do after that.
Well, yeah, and the old Westerns that come to mind, I think about like the really old black and white ones where they use that plate glass reverb to get that boot sound really awful sounding and overemphasize walking in those movies. But I agree. I think there's certain things like whether you're using an acoustic guitar or a mandolin or a banjo, you have to have some element of that in there because that's kind of what we're programmed to think of as a Western.
Yeah, no, for sure. And you can introduce other elements. Like this score we're going to talk about has a lot of electronic elements. You just can't hear them, right? So in terms of the traditional sense, like the heroes of the score are the traditional instruments. And I made double sure to make sure that we had a lot of those in there. And bear in mind, this film is, for the score, the film is a paranormal Western or a supernatural Western, if you will. So there's also the elements of, horror in this as well. So you've got these Western elements, like traditional, banjo, violin, but then you've got these like long kind of drones, and then you've got these sharp stingers, traditionally that you'd hear in like a Poltergeist movie or something. So it was a good marriage between the two, but you still had to have that Western thing. Because again, to your point, we're programmed to have that sound or hear that sound when we watch a Western. And if you don't, if you listen to one of these sort of modern Westerns where they want to go all avant-garde and have a completely electronic score, it dates itself very quickly. So that's one of the reasons why I chose to keep a lot of the score underpinned by the more traditional instruments that you would hear in a Western.
And we're going to play some samples from the score too. But one thing I want to touch on is that I think there's a beautiful balance, and there's so many points when I was listening to this for the first time where it just made me smile, Kevin, because you've got a beautiful blend of synthetic sound that's not dominant. It's really just creating like the bed of water for the, string boat to float on. It has to be there to make the boat float, but you don't sit there and focus on the water, you focus on the boat. So if your strings and your, whether you're using the banjo or violin, I guess in this case, it would be, what do they call it when you're doing a Western and it's a violin? It's not a violin. It's a I know what you mean. Yeah, the country version of it. Yeah, the fiddle.
Yeah, fiddle.
So whether you're using one of those elements, you're still floating on this just amazing sound bed that makes me feel like I'm in a Western environment, but I'm not watching a Western movie. Like I'm not watching a traditional Western movie, and I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. It's got that modern, like I really wanted it to be a bit of a modern score as well. So it's a marriage, like I said, of the traditional sort of like zings and pings of, like a kettle drum, someone just banging a kettle drum and it just reverberating with these more like Western European full-on orchestra elements. And like there's everything in there. And so, in this score, that's one of the reasons actually, just to talk about the planning for this. So the film Blood in Them Hills we've been in product, well, we're in production for about 3.5 years, and it's an independent film shot entirely here in Arizona. Great cast, great producers, like everybody allowed people the time to finish. And obviously COVID was a real detriment to the production, because we had to pause production a number of times because we unfortunately had a death of one of the producers. And then we had to pause there, and also, some sickness from the cast. So the actual production of the film really took it a long time, but that afforded me the time to be able to like really think about the score, like really think about like, what do we want to say? Do I want to rush this and do 12 tracks and just move on, or do I want to take my time and make a statement piece? And that's what I tried to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the movie, just to talk about the movie very quickly, and obviously then we'll talk about the score for the movie. But the movie just came out. It came out on the 18th. And it's available on streaming through Fandango, Apple. I think Amazon is coming soon. It's currently available in the US and Canada. European and worldwide distribution is coming very soon. So I'm not sure exactly when, but it will be available worldwide. But yeah, we had a premiere this past weekend, and I think it was just over 400 people in 2 cinemas.
Wow.
And really, yeah, just an amazing experience. And again, just coupled with the fact it took so long to make this thing, that it was just a big release for everybody to finally celebrate, something that we never thought we'd actually get out there, just given all the tribulations and stuff we had to go through.
Sure. Did you do a premiere at Tempe Pollock?
We did. Yeah. Great independent cinema here in Arizona. And those guys, local guys who don't know it or even do know it, will know that they are just fully supportive of independent film. Like, they put on a show for you. Like, they'll give you access to whatever you need, red carpet, all that kind of stuff. And they're very fairly priced in terms of like concessions, right? So they'll make good money out of the popcorn and the candy and the soda, but it's not like, high priced concessions. So everyone wins, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And I've been to a few premieres and a couple of 48-hour film challenge viewings there. And the theaters are just as nice as everywhere else. It's not like you're downgrading to get that element. I mean, it's just as good as a Harkins or anything else. It's a very beautiful theater, very well maintained, and you can't but help but to appreciate people that support independent film, because you know what? One day you might be the next Steven Spielberg or Hans Zimmer, right, and they don't know who they've got walking in the door.
Precisely, and that's exactly why I think their ethos is like, let's help the grassroots of the state to really get on a platform that can get to the next level. So can't speak higher of those guys. They really did put on a show for us, and I think everybody enjoyed it. So again, it's available streaming on your favorite streaming provider. I'm assuming everyone's Apple and Prime these days, but Fandango and some of these other third parties as well.
And, Amazon is typically a little bit further behind everybody else. Apple seems to be like, oh, you have something great, let me load it right now. And Amazon's like, we'll get to it. Don't worry.
That's right. Yeah. We got so much of the pipeline. We'll get to it when we get to it. So it will be available there as well.
Awesome. Now, I've seen the trailer, but I didn't catch, did Chris Sheffield write the film, or was he the director?
No, so Chris Sheffield was the DP, the director of photography. Okay. He was also co-director on set. So the film was actually written by the star of the film, Kellen Garner, who you will know from the previous Western that we did, Raw's Revenge, or Road to Revenge, as the distributor changed the name to.
Oh.
So this is kind of a follow-up to that. Most of the same crew, cast, producers, and again, but an entirely different story. So it's not a continuation of the first movie. This is an entirely new story, new characters, but yeah, really the same producers in the back end.
Now, it did appear, and I watched it on my phone, so maybe the colorization was a little bit off, but it did appear that there was snow in the background of some of the areas. Yes. Did you guys shoot up north?
We did. In the block of shooting, so this film was made in blocks. So the first part of the shooting that we did, I think just after COVID, when everything opened up again, we shot down in Rawhide in Chandler. Mm. And so a lot of the interiors and the exteriors of the town were shot there. We had some connections through some of the producers on the team and the cast to shoot there. But then Kellen really wanted to show off Arizona in terms of like, not everything in Arizona is desert and cactus and scorpions, right? We have the largest stretch of ponderosa pines in the world right here in Arizona. And so when winter comes, it snows, right? So we wanted to really show off that. And the great thing about that, it gives a good dynamic of the film, because you've got these sort of open town, hot places, and then completely juxtaposed with like freezing cold, snowy wilderness, with, big trees and fires and the typical kind of Western campfire stuff. And I think it worked because to base something in the same place, would have got old pretty quick. And I think that's what drives a lot of people not to like Westerns, is they don't change the scenery too much.
Yeah, you get that connotation of just dry, dusty roads, and you've got to be drinking water all the time because the air is just dusty and windy, and it's really cold at night. But to have that element, that does give a lot of character, I think, to the visual of the movie for sure.
It does, and also I as well as composing the music for this one, I also mixed the entire film. I did all the sound design, all of the ADR, basically everything sound in this film I did. So, the time afforded me to be able to do all that, and also the budget, if I must be honest. But, we were conscious of the fact that we needed a lot of time as well for one person to do all this stuff. And, I'm immensely proud of what we managed to do, because I really wanted, especially the scenes in the snow, I wanted the audience to feel that cold, and that's hard to do, right? You can show it, but how do you make them feel that cold? So a lot of time spent actually out recording those ambiences. So everything in the movie, there's not a lot of library stuff like you would typically get on a post-production. A lot of, especially the ambiences. I mean, the gunshots and things, 99% of those were all, library sounds, just kind of reinforced. But all of the ambiences, the wind blowing, the tree rustling, all of that was all recorded, in northern Arizona by myself. In fact, a funny story, a lot of the desert scenes, especially in the town, I went down to old Tucson studios in Tucson, which is where they shot, I think, Tombstone. Not Tombstone, I'm sorry. They've shot a lot of Westerns there, basically. But it's this really cool town in Tucson that you can go to. And I turned up with, a recorder and a boom pole and headphones, and just walked around getting ambiences, and nearly got kicked out because they obviously realized that, hey, are you allowed to do this? And I said, I'm just recording sound for, something. So very nearly got kicked out. But a lot of the sounds of the town were, the blacksmith and, the people, the wagon going past, the train, all of that stuff is all stuff I recorded, myself. So it's all original sounds.
Well, and what's really cool about that too is a lot of those places, because of COVID, have closed up. Some of the Western towns, I know there was one in Sedona that was this whole, big thing. They put on plays there. It was a huge deal to go there, and that's gone. They, couldn't fund it during COVID, and they had to sell it. And I know a lot of places have come victim to that. So I'm glad there's a place you could find to capture that. And I love that you wanted to do it organically too. You could have easily called our friend Rick Allen and said, "Hey, Rick, here's the list of stuff I need. What do you have?"
I think 3 or 4 times, Rick, I would love to just go visit his studio. Like I'm a studio geek when it comes to recording equipment, and even down to the furniture. Like we'll sit and talk for hours about the furniture that you put the speakers on. Right. And Rick has, an amazing studio I would love to visit, but he also owns a sound library company, and he actually produces sounds for this very thing. And I did have some consultations with him about the equipment he's used, and get kind of an idea what I needed to do. Remember, 15 years ago, I didn't know what end of a microphone I needed to plug in. So definitely reliant on friends and experts to sort of help me there. And I've amassed a lot of knowledge through that. But this score and this film is a culmination of what I've learned in the last 15 years. And again, hopefully people, when they watch it, it's an independent film, but they'll look at it and go, you know what, that's actually the production on that. It sounded like a proper film. It looks like a proper film. And that's all we can, aim to achieve. And I think we've done it, from the feedback we've received.
Well, that's great. And before we get into the music, I want to ask you about the mixing side of it. And let me say too, one thing that I really respect about you is that you did not cheat your way to get where you are. You took the
No.
time to learn how to do everything that you know how to do.
Yeah.
And I absolutely respect and love that about you, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. And it's the school of hard knocks, right?
Yeah.
If you want to learn something, go out and do it, and then learn where you made the mistakes, and then adjust. And that's really been the pathway that I've followed. I mean, I listen back to some of the older movies that I worked on, which I mixed as well. And I can hear things where in the today, Kevin, I would have done something a little bit different.
Sure.
Maybe the gunshots didn't have enough bass, or when you start mixing for films in 5.1 and surround, you really start having to know your stuff, because you have to understand, not to get too technical, but like what do you use the LFE for? The low frequency channel, the sub. What do you put in the surrounds? Do you just envelop the person in that? And to coin the term for the film, it is the Wild West in some respects, because you can listen to films where you've got music blasting out the rear speakers, and like every sort of gunshot is booming through the sub, and sometimes it's a little too much, right? So
Right.
you have to sort of learn this new discipline of like, okay, I need to like surround the person and make it sound like a film, but how do I manage the things like the rear speakers? What do I put in them? So you have to kind of learn traditionally, like listen to a lot of films in surround sound and sort of figure out what they do. And that's what I did. But also, again, talking to people like Rick and others about, what are the best practices. And that's how you learn, right? You do it, you adjust, and then you tweak it. And hopefully the next time you do it, it's a lot better.
Absolutely. And I've talked to filmmakers before where, they've sent me rough edits of their stuff and asked for my feedback. And I'll watch the film and go, I don't understand why this sound is coming into the right side of the headphones when it clearly is happening on the left. And that kind of stuff, as simple as that sounds, that will take the audience right out of the film, right out of making that story believable.
Yep.
It's the stuff that you don't even necessarily intend to show them, that if it's not right, they'll feel it and it will feel wrong, and they'll disassociate at that point.
It's a very careful balance from narrative to, is this going to take them out? And that is honestly one of the hardest things to do, because you want to put as much in there as possible, and you can, but you have to be very judicious with it. Like the rule with surround sound mixing, if anyone's interested, is, your center speaker is absolutely the king.
Yeah.
So dialogue has to come unless you're Chris Nolan, right? Dialogue has to come across, and people need to hear it. And that's actually one of the cool things about the premiere, is most conversations I had, a lot of it was a blur, but a lot of it was, thank you for letting me hear every single word. Like I heard every single word the actor said. And I'm glad, because I spent a lot of time, making sure that center speaker, the dialogue, is clear as possible, and everything else is secondary, even the music. You've got to hear the story. And so once you've settled on the dialogue and the those types of things, you can start introducing the music and then the sound effects and then all these other elements that make the film. But keep an eye on that dialogue, and that was a huge learning curve for me. Hours and hours and hours of research to make sure I did the right thing there. And again, hopefully,
that's a big thing, because when I've gone to theaters, even worse, when I watch them at home, they're mixed to where something is out of balance, and I constantly have to ride my volume dial or slider, whatever, I'm working off. And I hate having to do that. I should just be able to put the film on, not have to adjust anything, and be able to hear all the elements, everything from a cricket to an explosion. I shouldn't have to make adjustments.
The only thing that I've noticed that is different between different streaming platforms, like you're absolutely right, like everything should be balanced to each other, but the dialogue has to be the key.
Yes.
What I've noticed on a lot of streaming platforms is some will be quieter than others. Like we're not on HBO, but an HBO show is vastly quieter overall volume than something on Amazon Prime or Apple. And I noticed that on our film. In fact, I was listening back, just doing my QA, quality assurance on the mix, and everything was balanced beautifully, except the volume was lower. And so part of the continued, experience or the education that I need to do is, making sure that like music, it's important when you master a song that you are competitive with others, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where you don't want your song to be so quiet when you play the next track in the playlist that it's blasting out, and you're like, well, mine doesn't sound as good now because mine's not as loud. And in film, it's the same thing. So as long as my thing with film, it's a lot more forgiving, because as long as your balance is correct, i.e. your dialogue is good in relation to everything else, all you have to do is turn the volume up slightly, right? And everyone's got their different systems to play back on, and so that's a lot more forgiving than music. But at the same time, it's still a balance you have to correct.
Absolutely. And I don't mind having to find that, depending on what my platform is, I don't mind having to set it initially. But once I've dialed in, okay, this is how loud I want the film to be, the explosion should be within reason. The crickets should be within reason, to where I can sense them, but not even necessarily hear them, but I can feel that difference in the thing, which makes the mixing probably one of the most challenging parts of making a film.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I'll give you an example in the film. There's a scene about a third of the way through where I won't give too much plot away, but there's a gang that sort of goes to a hideout, and it's in the middle of the desert. And it was we shot in the middle of summer, and anybody who's been here in the summer will know the cicadas and, general monsoon insects come out, and they're loud, right?
Yes.
And so it just so happened that when we shot that scene, it was during that cicada explosion. And all you could hear was cicadas everywhere. And so what I ended up doing is, because we shot in different times of the day, as you do when you put a film together, there was scenes where there was no cicadas, like early morning. If we had a pickup shot, for example, that we missed the day before, I would have to go back in and pull the cicada noise from the scene, that we shot the day before, and lay it with further cicadas in order to make it seamless. And so you can't, because there's a point where you can't strip out every single noise because it sounds unnatural. So you have to work with what you've got, but then you can supplant it and add additional noises just to kind of, especially when you're going between cuts that were shot in different days, and just make it so when the audience looks at it, they think you shot that literally, all within 2 hours. And in retrospect, it was actually over 3 days.
See, and that's the thing that, you have a little more advantage when you're working on like a film with a multi-million-dollar budget, because you can schedule around those kind of things. You can either schedule it to be when it's happening or around when it happens. But when you're working on an indie film, you have to just do it when you can do it.
And the old age-old adage of "we'll fix it in post" really does, unfortunately, come into play, because you don't have the luxury of extending the shoot out a day in order to capture the same thing again. You have to just work with what you got. And so where sound can play a good role is, there was a lot of scenes in this where when I got the final locked cut, which for everybody who doesn't know film production, that's the version that the sound guy, i.e. me, will then use to sort of finalize the sound and do all the corrective actions on the voices and the add in the special effects and all that kind of stuff. And what I found is, there was just huge gaps opening up. And so what we did to fill that is I would narratively add in, ADR, which for those who don't know is automatic dialogue replacement. Not necessarily to replace people's voices on set, which is what it's typically used for, but to add more narrative elements to it. Like there's a gunfight scene early in the movie, and it just felt empty. Yes, you had the gunshots and you had the characters running around, but there was no other. We didn't capture any other sound. So what I ended up doing is spending a couple of days with a bunch of actors running around the desert outside my house with the microphone, just shouting stuff. And when you lay that stuff in, it then becomes full, right? You have this scene of, cannibals attacking the group. Again, not to give too much away, but halfway through the movie, there's another big gunfight scene. And again, it felt very empty. And so a lot of the work we did is just adding elements to tell more of a fuller sound in the story. And again, months and months of that work went on in order to kind of make it feel like, this stuff was all happening on the day. But in retrospect, we actually, a year later is when we recorded a bunch of that stuff and just made it fit.
Right. And that's the beauty of the art, I think, is that we do have the ability to do whatever we need to do after the fact to give a believability to what we actually did.
Exactly. Yep.
You know,
that's what we're there for.
yeah,
Yep.
it's funny to say it that way. And to give a little background on Locked Picture, what that's supposed to be is that the director and the editor will say, okay, this is finalized. We may modify from here. So we'll give a copy to the special effects guys. We'll give a copy to the composer. We give a copy to the sound effects guys, or in this case, we just give it all to Kevin. Yeah. And then everybody goes and does their parts to fill in each of those scenes for whatever they're responsible for.
That's exactly right.
I don't know how often this has happened to you, but it's happened to me multiple times where I'll get the film and they'll go, okay, the picture's locked. And then a week later, they'll go, oh, well, we had to use this other take, so it's going to be 3 minutes longer. I'm like, well, I've already written the music for that. Now I have to go back, and changes the continuity. It changes the pacing. It changes the beat, the heartbeat of the film. So Locked Picture is a very important thing, but I'm always like a little, when somebody tells me that I've got Locked Picture, I'm like, do I though?
That's honestly, an independent film, expect there to be some changes, because again, independent film in its nature is a run and gun. And so that includes, like, when everyone's typically in big film productions, everybody signs off on it, right? And it takes an act of Congress to change anything. Whereas in independent film, you like it on a Wednesday and then you watch it on a Saturday and go, I think we should have used that other shot. Well, and so to them, it's no big deal, right? Because they're just editing. But what they don't realize is the knock-on effect to the sound guy, to the special, not so much the special effects guy, because they typically work in scenes, right? Like effects scenes, but the sound guy is the most affected because, again, to your point, you've written the music for that particular, scene or whatever. The actual editing, the dialogue edit of the movie, the sound effects, everything is to a frame. Like,
right,
what is it, 1/8 of a second or something in a frame, or whatever the calculation is. You've done everything to literally pinpoint calculations, and even adding an extra 2 seconds can completely blow it all out the window. So super important. When they say locked cut, they mean it, but be prepared that they don't mean it.
Exactly. And especially if you're tying it to a visual cue. Like, let's say that somebody drops a strawberry on the ground, and there's something that's really important about that strawberry. And you might put a piece in the music that kind of enhances that effect or emotion. Maybe you put like a little descending cello note in there that follows the strawberry down. And if they add 2 seconds to that scene, now everything's out of place. The music needs to start earlier, or, needs to be extended at the end. And now the placement of that sound might not work with the piece the way you had it. And it's that simple. Like, that simple thing can completely ruin a piece of music.
And it really comes into play for things like Foley, right? And again, for those that aren't aware, Foley is additional sound effects that you add onto the production sound. So if you film a strawberry falling on the ground, 99% of the time, they're not going to catch that in the audio. The same thing with footsteps, right? If you've got footsteps and you want to enhance, you can't hear them typically unless it's an interior, but an exterior, forget about it. I added, layers and layers of Foley footsteps, pats on the back, fight sounds, you name it. Every single one of those things is impacted if you don't have a locked cut, because if they extend it by even a second, everything's out of place.
Right. Exactly. So my last question for you before we get into the music about the mixing side of things, composers tend to historically have to fight with editors and directors to get their music loud enough to be heard. I actually had to fight with a director one time to turn the music down because it was actually overriding the dialogue. When you're mixing everything yourself, how do you find the balance where you want to get your music heard, but you also know it needs to be more felt than heard?
I, again, had the luxury of being the post mixer as well as the composer. So the decision was mine. I luckily had the trust of Kellen and Chris Sheffield to make those decisions. And there were obviously, discussions around certain things that they wanted me to tweak, those types of things. But for the most part, having that North Star of dialogue is king, always in the back of my mind, that was an easy decision for me to say, okay, I love this piece of music I've written. I really want it to be loud. and heard because I'm the composer, but I'm also have to understand that the dialogue and the story is king, absolute number one. And so it was an easy decision for me. Where it was difficult were like fight scenes, for example, like any kind of action scenes, because I like my music to be louder, because especially when it's driving, underpinning an action scene. And so those were the difficult parts for me, because I really wanted, I wanted the audience to like just absolutely get blown away by the sound and the energy of the music, because I felt it was an important factor to that scene. So those were the harder parts. But again, the good thing being the mixer for the film as well as the composer, I knew that I had to strike that balance. And the balance was, as long as you can hear the dialogue, I'll bring the music up as high as I can before the dialogue is then inaudible. And that really drove the whole decision making.
That's a really smart benchmark. And for things like fight scenes, unless there's, repartee during that scene, the music would typically drive an action sequence like that. And you'll have your crowd, people screaming or being worried or laughing or whatever they're doing in the background. That's going to be an element of the sound that's got to be in there to make it feel alive, like you were saying. But unless you have dialogue, your drive for that scene would be the music.
For sure. And there's always opportunities in the creative side to sort of like drown out the sounds, like the Foley and the environmental sounds, and even the dialogue in some cases, and just have the music, especially if it's a creative decision. And they work fine too. But in this movie, Kellen really, like initially, he really wanted sparse music. He didn't want a lot of music driving the story. He wanted the story to drive. But when we came to, the cut, I realized, look, that's fine, but this film, for whatever reason, I think needs more music to sort of fill in those holes. And so he was very willing to listen to my suggestions. And what I would typically do is, instead of just telling him, I would show him. I would spend a day or so writing a very quick cue, not the finished product, but something that just showed the difference between what that scene had before music and what it had after. And most of the time, he 100% agreed. And then we would put it, I would use that placement for a cue, and I would finish a cue and then put it in, and it would work fantastically. Very rarely did we have any examples where he said, I don't want sound here, or I don't want I don't want these instruments in this particular. He trusted my judgment on that. And that's why I think we've worked together really well. This is our fourth movie together. And he trusts that judgment for me to say, look, Kellen, I really think, I get that you want just the story to really fill in the narrative for the audience, but like, man, this would be really good if we just had a dark underpinning string just to kind of like emphasize what's happening. And again, he would fully trust that. But it's a huge balance. I mean, you think about a scene, like there's 30, 40 scenes in a movie. You've got to then sort of extrapolate yourself from just one scene and then make sure that you're managing the whole movie and you're not just firing music for the sake of it. Because again, like I said, I wrote probably close to 32, 33 pieces of music for this, all in varying lengths. I didn't use it all, which is a good thing to have. But at the same time, you don't want to just envelop the audience in just, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's better sometimes to have nothing and just the sound of a cricket in the background, or flies. There's a scene in the movie where there's flies, and that's all you hear for a good 15 seconds. And that scene needed to breathe. And that's why the absence of music actually can help in that regard.
Well, and that's the beauty of Underscore too, because sometimes, you have music that's really aggressive. Sometimes you have music that attaches to a visual, like an explosion, or, the killer's coming around the corner, and you're trying to feel let the audience feel the attention of the lead actor, whatever you're doing to enhance that visual. But then there's the underscore, and there's some on here that I really love that's just like a simple, sustained hanging note. Something that just takes the silence away, but doesn't focus on the music at all.
It supplements, right? Yeah. And again, those types of scenes that you'll see in the movie where you've got those just it could be just something as simple as like a death rattle or something. They were important because I felt like it was too sparse without at least something, but it didn't need to be this massive orchestra, right?
Yeah.
And there are scenes in the movie that do have this driving orchestra with massive amounts of, basses, strings, violins, and everything. But yes, those scenes were very important too, to just have even a wind chime, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just a background wind chime for 5-6 seconds. And it allows the audience to breathe. And you want the ebbs and flows for that, for a movie, to have them go on that journey instead of just whacking them over the head like a Mad Max style thing where you're just getting fed gritty music over and over and over again. And you come out of the movie like panting because you're like, man, that was a crazy experience. And this wasn't that type of movie. It needed to have it needed to breathe, and it needed those elements to just guide it along. And then when those big orchestra elements come back in later on, you're ready for it because you haven't had it smashed over your head for the whole duration before it.
And to anyone listening who's not familiar with this process, what I would suggest you do is take a movie that you know well, that has a couple of really strong themes that you could hum in your head, whether it be a movie like E.T. or Jaws or Star Wars, something that you know a couple of themes in. And then just like really tune out the dialogue and focus on the music. And you'll realize how much music is in the film that you didn't even know was in there because you were meant to feel it more than hear it. There's parts where music is meant to drive the film and parts where music is meant to just enhance the sound or enhance the atmosphere. And that's like
Precisely.
Songs versus underscore.
Yep, that's exactly right. There is a time and a place for that big kind of epic sound. But then there's times where you just want something to carry it and just focus on the dialogue and what's happening.
Yeah, like everybody knows the Imperial March from Empire Strikes Back, right? Da 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 da. But what happens after that theme is done playing?
Yep. You've got time to breathe, or you've got maybe a solo string section that's just playing a motif that's just in the background enough to sort of hear.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not being driven because there's no need for it, right? And again, it's important to breathe. Films need, in order for you to sit through an hour and 40-minute movie, it has to ebb and flow. It has to breathe.
Yeah.
And I'm a firm believer in like Chris Nolan films where he does have this, with Hans Zimmer doing the score, or the other guy, the Swedish guy that did Oppenheimer.
Oh yeah.
Like those the score is absolutely stunning, but it's not there the whole way through. And it really peaks when it needs to, but the rest of the time it's just there in the background, or it's not there at all. And you can focus then on the narrative that's happening with the dialogue.
Absolutely. And it's such a balance that as a composer you have to have. You like, do you do what I do where you start with a list of, okay, here's the key scenes that need to be very musical or very aggressive. And then here's a list of the pieces that I need to cover that need to be more underscore. And then I start with that. And then I'm like, okay, now let's work on themes. And then once I have themes, then I know where I'm replicating or doing a variation and can start working off that. Because I feel if you don't break it down, you can really get lost in what you're trying to accomplish in the overall cohesiveness of the score.
100%. Like our process with Kellen is, he and I will do a virtual spotting session. So he'll be at home, I'll be at home in the studio. We'll kind of listen or watch the film, or he'll send me a note list of like, here's where I really think we need sound.
Mm-hmm.
He's not sure what that sound might be. Maybe he's clear on it. Maybe he's like, this scene needs like drums, it needs this. And or other times he's like, we need something, I just don't know what it is. And other times, like I said earlier, he says, we don't need sound here. And then after we watch this, the scene, he'll change his mind, or I will try and change his mind and say, I really believe we need something in there. But yeah, spotting sessions, first thing that happens. Second is themes. And I'm a firm believer in themes. And what I mean by that for those listening is each character typically will have a theme. And it could be something as simple as a 4-note motif, or it could be an instrument, right? It could be a style of instrument. Like we've got a character in this who's sort of coming off some melancholy in life and some really sad things. And his themes are really driven like very, very mournfully, right? Because of the experiences he's going through. Whereas you've got another character, Joe Good, who played by Kellen. Joe is sort of the principal actor and the primary protagonist, and his themes are a little bit more joyful. It sounds kind of crazy, but his character has a lot of the humor in the film, and there's a lot of humor in this film too. And so I didn't want given that he's a bad guy, I didn't want the traditional sort of bad guy, good, the bad, the ugly type thing. I wanted his music to sort of show more of his character than you would actually see, or I'd say past character than you had seen. So it enables you to sort of learn about who he is through the music, as opposed to just seeing what he does on the screen, if that makes sense. And then we had some amazing Native American actors in this film as well, from the Apache tribe up in the White Mountains. And so, you could go very traditional with that, which I sort of did. I lent very much into like Indian flutes, especially from that area. And I did. And a lot of the work I did for their scenes was very much like, I want, again, you expect to hear certain things with their characters, but I also took it in a slightly different direction with some of again, not to give anything away, but, they're not your traditional bad guys in the cowboy and Indian type films. They have a really good arc themselves. And so the music helped supplement that and helped educate the audience on, these aren't your traditional sort of like, Native Americans in a cowboy epic. There's actually more to it, and the sound needed to reflect that.
Well, and that's what I loved about your use of flutes. And I was going to ask you about that, because it seems like you have the element in there that gives us the recognition, but you're not using it in the traditional way of seeing a person out in the open desert just playing a flute and that's all we're hearing in that traditional style. It's like the inflection of it, so you can identify with the character, but not here's an Indian playing a flute kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. It's taking the traditional that you expect to hear, but sort of flipping it in certain circumstances where, you sort of, again, you recreate certain things. You can use the basis of it for the familiarity, but then you can do something kind of cool with it that's people aren't expecting. And that's what I tried to do in a lot of this score is, take the traditional, paranormal / supernatural elements, try and turn them on their heads, sometimes straight down the barrel, right? So there'd be a big stinger when there's a monster show up. But, a lot of the stuff I'd really tried to experiment with and do something different. Because every score that I work on, I want to ground people, but I also want people to go, I haven't really heard that before. And so that's the experimental side of it for sure.
Right. No, I really like that.